back for another 1 year Torah portion reading. And today we are in, and I'm going to probably say this wrong because, it's transliterated for me, Miketz, at the end, Genesis 41:1 through 44:17. And this is the almost culmination of the story of Joseph, right? He sees his brother for the first time, and, well, I got to say, I'm going to guess we're looking at somewhere in between 20 and 25 years. Right? They probably throw him in the pit sometime around 13 to 16 years old. He rises to...
Well, he was 17. It says he was 17.
Does it actually give us a timestamp? I didn't see the timestamp.
And then he's 30.
He's 30
here,
when
so it's been over a decade.
Well, no, but then there's 7 years of plenty.
Oh, that's right. So
then we have
20,
so
20,
he's at least 37. Yeah. So 20 years, and then we don't know how far into the famine it is. Maybe 2 years, 3 years. So we could be at 22 years or so from the time that he sees his brothers. And it's weird because when we get into narrative like this, and I'll shoot this over to you because I'm sure you got plenty to say, but when we get into narrative like this, I kind of fall apart when it comes to looking at, I'm more of the, let's look at the laws, narrative is easy for me because I don't get into the nitty gritty of it. I just read it for what it is. And it's like, oh, this is the story. You know what I mean? This is such a fun and easy story. It's like, I have a hard time picking it apart, but I'm sure we will do just that. Go for it, Rob. What do we have for today?
Yeah. This is of all the scripture that can get me in tears. It's this story of Joseph and his brothers, and I know that you guys decided to name your firstborn Benjamin, right? Benjamin. And of course this is a crucial moment. Benjamin is the only tribal ancestor, if you will, or father of the tribes born in the land. His mother dies while he's being born and says Ben Oni, which is something like son of my mourning or son of, but it could mean one of two things. It could mean it could mean son of my strength, if you take on to be strength, or it could mean son of my mourning, like Mour, like my sadness. And so it seems like Joseph or Jacob names him, and this is the only son. I think we've talked about this before. Benjamin is the only son that Jacob named, right? All the other names of all the tribes came from the women with their back and forth, trying to
son
oust
of my
each
right
other.
hand. Yeah.
Yeah. So he says son of my right hand, which kind of solidifies the meaning son of my strength. But we see, again, Jacob's protection of Benjamin here. His sons go to Egypt, of course. They come before Joseph, and it says Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize Joseph. And he keeps this. He says, "You're spies." Obviously, we know that he doesn't really believe they're spies.
Right.
So we, the reader knows that we know something that the brothers don't know this whole time. And we have to keep that in mind. It's a ruse. Joseph is testing them.
It's a ruse. Yeah.
He knows they're not spies, but he keeps acting like, don't you know how powerful I am? Even this, I remember having a talk once with a brother who's like, oh, see, Joseph did divination. And I'm like, no, you have to understand.
That's
I said,
interesting.
This is part of the pretense that Joseph is building up. Don't you know that I have a cup that I can divine things? That's part of the play acting that Joseph is presenting, because he wants to, I don't believe it's revenge. He wants to test their hearts. He wants to see, will they protect Benjamin? Do they still love my father? Right? But also we get these little glimpses of Joseph's life, how God blesses him. We saw it last week in the Torah portion. Even though he's been cast out, sold into slavery, he puts God first, like the whole thing with the woman, Potiphar's wife, and he's interpreting dreams. He's helping. It's like God's given him the interpretation to help Egypt and the whole world. And then he has two sons, Menashe and Ephraim. And it says that when he names these boys, he has a theological reasoning. Like, God has caused me to forget, my pain, Menashe, and Ephraim. God has made me doubly fruitful. And so he's still, we get these glimpses of Joseph thinking of his life or framing his life with a godly theological orientation. We don't get that with the brothers. Right. We don't get, and Reuben thought, how could I sin against God? No, they're all about themselves. They're all about themselves.
So I want to pause for a few seconds to go back because we see a couple of different things here. First of all, you're right, this play acting of, don't you know I can do divination? But then he says, I think he's still play acting when he says, I think, or play acting, however we want to say that, right? He's still trying to put up this image to his brothers when he says, well, I fear your God too. So I'm going to let, like he says that at one point, he says, oh, I fear your God as well. Like I have all these, I have all these gods, right? But your God is one that I think I fear as well. And then another thing that's very interesting to me, and one of the things that I think is maybe not talked about quite as much as it could be, is the fact that Joseph is given this woman as a wife who is the daughter of a high priest of On, right? And clearly, I would say that at least when he gets this wife, she's not. It seems as though he hasn't been secretly telling her about the God of Israel, right? I mean, it's not like she's a believer at this point. So he gets this Egyptian woman who has probably been raised in a very, very pagan home, right? High priest of On, and then she's the mother of two tribes, which is really, really interesting to me. And I mean, we see the same kind of thing with Moses, right? He marries an Egyptian woman as well. But ultimately, we have two tribes coming from an Egyptian woman who, at least in the beginning, we have to assume is not a follower of the God of Israel, which I find that fascinating. So yeah, I agree with you. There's this whole play acting kind of thing that he puts up. I had one more thing, but keep going.
Well, on that note too. Okay, so we're told that Joseph names his two sons, but he gives them Hebrew names. Mm-hmm. But in the same passage, we're given all these other Egyptian names, like you're pointing out. Like, well, Pharaoh we see all over the place. Paro, that's not a Hebrew word. That's an Egyptian word, and it means great house. And On you mentioned the city On, was translated into Greek as Heliopolis, the city of the sun. And if you do some research on Heliopolis, it's just a little bit north in the river delta, just north of Cairo. It's one of the oldest sites that had those obelisks, the giant obelisk that go back to like 1900 BC. So there was like worship of Ra there. And then Safnat Paneach is the name that is
Joseph's
given to Joseph. And it means the God says he will live. That's what that means in Egyptian. So you have Joseph's being given Egyptian names, and then Joseph gives Hebrew names to his children. Apparently his wife didn't mind, but Asenath also means like belonging to the goddess Net. That's what Asenath means, belonging to the goddess Net. Potiphera means given by Ra. And so we see this cluster of like Egyptian names, of course, spelled in Hebrew. It's like
transliterated,
written in Hebrew. Yeah.
Right.
So what do we do with this? What do we do with how could, like you just pointed out, Joseph isn't like, hey, you guys, this is all paganism. There's somehow Joseph recognizes, and this is important. Joseph recognizes that God's doing something, right, but Joseph's not in a hurry to resolve it. And I wonder if he's learned something about patience, about waiting on God, because what we know from our last Torah portions, where he was put in prison, and then he gets elevated inside the prison. Before prison, he gets elevated in the house, right, in the house of his master. Then he gets unjustly thrown into prison. He gets elevated in the prison. And there's the one time at the end of last week's Torah portion where he interprets the dreams, and then he tells one of Pharaoh's servants, says, remember me, remember that I'm unjustly down here. It's like he's trying to resolve his own situation. He's trying to accelerate the relief from his suffering, right? He wants it to end. So he's like, remember me, and then it says the guy forgot all about him, right? Until Pharaoh had these dreams. It says it was 2 years later.
Right?
But
you can feel that tension.
I mean, there's
build.
times, how many times in our life they're like, man, I just want whatever this difficult trial that I'm in, I want it to just, and there's a sense in the flesh to try to accelerate, like, okay, how do I get myself out of this thing? And there's times where we got ourselves into some sort of thing and we need to get ourselves out. But there's times like with Joseph, like there's nothing Joseph's going to do that's going to speed up the timeline. And so God is teaching, one of the things I think that God is teaching Joseph, because it says that Miketz at the beginning of our Torah portion means at the end of 2 years. That means he said, don't forget me. Don't forget I'm in here. And he probably held on to this hope that, like I helped that guy. He's going to put in a good word. I'll be out of here next week, right? 2 years. And so, there's times where we hope for things.
Right.
And God says no, and then it's like, wow. So when Yeshua says, seek first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, all these other things will be added unto you. That's when it's like we're hoping in things that are from God. And then if that's true, then we have to trust God's timing. And in the end of the story, Joseph looks back. He's like, look, God had a plan here, you guys. I'm not mad at you. You meant it for evil, but God meant it for good.
That's coming up next week, right?
And, and it's so easy to say that. Like, oh yeah, God has a plan. But, when Paul says, we're crucified to the world, and the world to us, or that we're crucified with Messiah. There's one of I think the big truths there is that, what is that? That is the word of God separating in our hearts, those hopes that are not from him that we have, even if we think it's a good thing, if it's not from God, and we end up like grieving over it, he's going to say, get over it. It's not from me. You got to wait for me. And so Joseph, all this is just to highlight the point that this is God's timeline. Right. Joseph can't speed it up. The brothers can't speed it up. Jacob can't speed it up. I mean, man, they're letting the brothers start thinking, oh, you remember how our brother, he cried out for us to show him mercy and we didn't listen to him. Now all this affliction is, God's found us out.
Okay.
And they're trying to apply theology.
Okay. But you know what? I was thinking about this when I was reading this passage, and I was trying, just like when we started, I was trying to kind of figure out timeline here. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, we have 22 years in between the time that they throw him into the pit and then sell him to the time that they show up in Egypt. Okay. For the first time. They equate what's going on when they go back and they're starting to have trouble with this ruler of Egypt. They equate this with punishment from God for what they did to Joseph. But to me, the very first thing that I think is, this is not the first time that this has happened. These guys, every time something goes bad, these guys are sitting there going, "Oh, look, God is punishing us for Joseph." To me,
and they're wrong, right? The question for our readers is, do we agree with their assessment?
Yeah, but I guess my point is that it's not like this is the first time that they've been like, oh, God's punishing us. They've been, it's not like they forgot about Joseph, and now all of a sudden this happens 22 years later, and they're like, oh yeah, Joseph. to me, it's like the weight of their sin has been, it's like in Pilgrim's Progress, you know,
It's like
he's
guilt,
carrying that
the
giant
guilty
boulder
conscience.
on his back, right? And every time something bad happens, they think God's punishing us for this thing. For 22 years, roughly 22 years, they're carrying this thing around, and it just show. I tell my kids this always. There's always for every action, there's a reaction, and whatever it is, whether it's good or bad. If you do something good, something might happen good. If you do something bad, something might happen bad. You never know, but there's always going to be a reaction to something that you do. And to me, this is like the biggest reaction to the biggest, sin that they've done. They've been carrying this reaction for over 20 years. And so to me, it's like, man, I think that, when they come to realize that it's Joseph, I think there's this, and this comes next week, right? But I think that there is this first dread of, oh my word, we're gonna die. Like he's the most powerful person in the world, except for one dude, right? Pharaoh. He's second most powerful person in the world. But I think that after they realize they're not gonna die, and also I have to assume that telling their dad, oh, by the way, Joseph is alive. Do they just say, hey, guess what? A wild beast didn't eat him, or do they actually? Or do they actually own up to it? You know what I mean? Do they own up to like, oh, by the way, we sold him, right? You don't know.
That's a good question. Did they just avoid, like, what the true confession would be, Dad, remember that coat? We actually put the blood on there.
Yeah.
Because we didn't know what else to do.
But you have to assume that it's like, when I was reading Pilgrim's Progress growing up, we read there was a picture version of it, right? And the illustrations were beautiful. It was all black and white, like pencil drawn illustrations, right? And, he's carrying this giant boulder. And then when he sees the cross, there's all of a sudden a pit behind him and the boulder's like falling off into the pit. And I just assume that for the brothers, after Dad knows, after everything is resolved, it's like the boulder's fallen off. They've been carrying this thing around for so long, and now it's like they're freed from it. So anyway, these are the kind of things that I think of every time I read this story is, back to, did they tell Dad? Did he, what, and then what was, what was Jacob's response to that?
Yeah.
Clearly he's overjoyed, right? There's this his son is alive. He's so happy. But man, is he just burning mad at his other sons now, or does he not know? Maybe they think if we tell him, because they say if he loses Benjamin, he's going to die. He'll have a heart attack if Ben goes by the wayside, we're done. So maybe they just think, hey, we can't tell Dad what we actually did. If we do that, he's going to have a heart attack and die.
Yeah, I think one other bit too on this character development of the other brothers. We see a word that's only used twice in the Greek Torah, dikaio, is to justify. It's only twice in Genesis, and both times it's from tzedek. It's in the verb form in Hebrew. It's only used by Judah, and it's used by Judah twice. One is when Tamar shows the receipts. Oh, the father is, like we talked about this before, right? With Roshat Vayeshev. The father is whoever belongs to these things, right? Or these things belong to the father. And he says, she's more righteous than I. So he uses that word, she is righteous, rather than me, is what it means.
Right.
And then here at the end of this week's Torah portion is the only other time we have it in Genesis, and it's also Judah. And it's when Joseph plants the divination cup in with Benjamin, and then sends the guys out knowing, because he wants to see how are the brothers going to respond. And Judah says, what words can we say to our Lord? We are your servants. How there's no way for us to justify ourselves. And that's that word there. And so to me, it's like, wow, why in the Torah, Moses is showing us, he's coupling the character development of Judah with uttering something about justification. And in both cases, Judah is speaking the truth. He's in a situation where he's painted into a corner by his own deeds.
Right.
And he is speaking the truth that he is not the one who's justified. Right. And so with the Tamar, it's like he was painted in a corner. It's like, and he has to say, he speaks the truth. She's the one in the right, not me. And then here, painted into a corner by Joseph, because now he's like, oh, what am I going to do? Judah already told his dad that he would give his own life to defend Benjamin. And Jacob's like, okay, go ahead, trusting Judah. And then so Judah's the one who speaks. There's what can we say before my Lord? And they're like, take us all, because they don't want to go back and see their dad. And he's like, no, I'm just going to keep the guy with the cup. You all go back. And they're just like, and that's the end of, it's like a cliffhanger. Our Torah portion ends with like, what's Judah going to do? How's Judah going to respond?
I think that there's almost there's a tell in here about who Joseph is to his brothers, and they don't catch it. Because his servants, it says that they sit down to eat, right? They know that he's going to eat bread. Excuse me. They come to his house. His servants won't eat with him, with Joseph, and he eats with his brothers. But it's an abomination for the Egyptians to eat with shepherds. So this is why his servants won't eat with him. They don't catch that. They don't get that his servants aren't eating with him, that the Egyptians seclude themselves.
Oh, I thought Joseph did not eat with his brothers.
Well, see, now I was confused on whether or not he sits down with his brothers or not, but Joseph's servants.
But he does line them up in birth order.
But Joseph's servants won't eat with him. It says that his servants won't eat with Joseph.
Right.
And so his brothers don't catch that. They don't get, like, to me that's almost like a tell, like that. It's almost like he's kind of tipping his hand to
the cues are right. The interpretive cues are there,
right,
for those who have eyes to see.
Yeah, I was confused on whether or not Joseph actually eats with them or if he's secluded by himself. I was confused.
But also,
by that.
One of the other bits here is because the Tanakh doesn't have a lot of emotion, like it's implied, like you read Genesis 22, like Abraham's taking Isaac up and, for gonna slaughter him. And like, we're just not told. And so people, he was just like not feeling anything. He was just stoic, or we're supposed to go, wow. Well, here we get serious glimpses of Joseph where he can't contain himself. Like he wants so desperately to like say, hey, it's me. And he wants to hug him. He wants to say, I forgive you. He wants to say, God meant this for good. He wants to hug Benjamin for sure. He wants to know about his dad. How's Jacob doing? Like, and so he's holding this front, this masquerade for the purpose of testing their heart. But that's not his goal. This is not just to grind them into the ground. He desperately wants reconciliation. He desperately wants reconnection. But so as we're reading the story, you see him trying to hold it. And every time, every once in a while, he has to like duck away and he like cries. He's like, I can't do this much longer,
See, I it's interesting you kind of bring that up, because when I was reading this, I was thinking to myself, okay, I personally believe that Moses wrote this, right? Moses writes this story. So in the timeline, where are we at? When we get to Exodus 33, 33:11, it says, the Lord spoke with Moses face to face as a friend speaks to a friend, right? And we have this idea that Moses would go into his own tent and God would come and speak face to face with him, right? And to me, it's like he's giving him the creation story. He's giving him the Abrahamic story, right? And we kind of see these different, it's like God's giving him the story, and then he writes down the story, and this is what we have. When we get to the Joseph story, and when we get to, everything, how Israel makes it into Egypt, and how now the person who's writing the story is going to take them, be the mouthpiece for God, and then lead them out of Egypt. I almost wonder if, coming to Egypt was this story that Joseph told his kids, and his kids, they're passing this down for a very long time. And so it's almost like the folklore. So yes, God is telling him what to write, but at the same time, it's like Moses knows this story now because it's part of the lore and part of the family history of Israel in Egypt and why Moses brought them out. And maybe we see a little bit more detail.
Yeah, exactly. And I think in some of those situations, God's like, okay, that story?
Yeah.
And then tell it this is how you're, and he gives him like this, okay, tell it, but make sure, you got to tell it this way.
I'm going to give you detail here. See, I personally, and I wrote an article about this years ago, and I don't even think it's available anymore because I didn't think it was that great. But I argued in that video or in that article that Exodus 33:11 it's actually telling us that it's a pre-incarnate Yeshua. In other words, there is a physical, just like when the leaders of Israel go up and they see the God of Israel and he has feet, right? I argued in that that Exodus 33:11 is telling us that Yeshua, pre-incarnate Yeshua, is actually speaking with Moses in his tent and telling him what to write. So I think that there is a little bit of God saying, okay, exactly what you're saying. Remember that story, but here's some details that you don't know about it. Anyway, okay, that's going to do it for us today. We will be back, hopefully, Lord willing, we will be back next week. And next week, we have Vayigash, and he approached Genesis 44:18 through 47:27. As I said, Lord willing, we will be back for that. We hope that you have a great Shabbat and a wonderful Hanukkah, as it is currently Hanukkah right now in this part when we're recording this. And all right, we will see you next week.